I never believed in ghosts, not seriously at least. I told myself I was too logical, too grounded, to fall for stories of shadows moving on their own or whispers echoing in empty rooms. And yet, that night changed everything. It started like any other evening. I was alone in my apartment, the hum of the city outside my window, the soft flicker of my desk lamp casting familiar shapes on the walls, normal, safe, predictable. I had just finished a late dinner, and the quiet settled around me like a comforting blanket. That's when I noticed it. A movement in the reflection of my bedroom window. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, the street lamp shifting with the wind. But then I saw her, standing behind me, perfectly still, her face pale and eyes hollow, staring straight into mine from a reflection that shouldn't exist. I spun around, heart hammering, expecting an empty room. Nothing, just the familiar furniture, the scattered books, the little plant on the windowsill. Yet when I looked back at the glass, she was there again, closer this time. It's funny how normal life can make you question what you see. The sound of the refrigerator, the faint traffic noise, the ticking clock. They all felt like anchors, insisting that nothing was wrong. But that reflection, it refused to obey reality. I could feel her, just beyond the surface of the glass, waiting, watching. And that's when I realized something terrifying. Whatever she didn't belong to the world I knew. Some things linger where they shouldn't, just beyond the edge of perception. And I had stumbled right into one of them. I should have turned away, left the room, or even screamed, but something kept me rooted. A mixture of fear and fascination that I can't explain. And now, as I recount this, I know that the story I am about to tell isn't just a memory, it's a warning. Because what I experienced that night was only the beginning. And what I'm about to share with you, well, you might wish you hadn't asked, but I suppose you're ready, aren't you? Ready to step past the threshold where normal life ends and the unseen begins. The first sign of what waited for me came with a sound I'll never forget. Story number 1. The haunted apartment. It started with the faucet, dripping, even though I hadn't touched it. At first, I thought it was a loose washer or a prank by the building maintenance. But when I bent down to check, the sound stopped, only to resume a few minutes later, echoing through the otherwise silent apartment. Then, the small things began. Keys that I swore I'd left on the counter ended up in the fridge. A chair would be slightly turned when I came back from the bathroom. At first, I laughed nervously to myself. Great, I'm losing it. I muttered, shaking my head. But the unease wouldn't leave. One night, I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone, when I heard a whisper. Soft, deliberate, just behind my ear. Leave. Now, I froze, convinced it was someone playing a cruel joke. Who's there? I called, my voice barely more than a squeak. Nothing. Just the hum of the heater. By the third week, I began noticing patterns. The dripping would start exactly at 2:17 a.m. Objects moved in sequences that made no sense, and every time I tried to leave the apartment for a few hours, something seemed to follow me in my absence. Have any of you heard of apartments like this? Places where reality bends just enough to make you doubt your own senses? I started recording everything, hoping for an explanation. But every clip came out wrong. Shadows in corners where there shouldn't be any. Reflections that didn't match the room, and always that faucet, dripping in a rhythm that felt like a countdown. By the time I realized it wasn't just a prank or my imagination, it was too late. Something had already made itself at home. And looking back now, that apartment was just the beginning. The true horror was waiting to reveal itself. Story number 2. The Shadow in the Woods. We thought it would be a fun weekend. Just a few friends, tents, and a quiet escape into the woods. The kind of trip that felt harmless, almost cinematic. But the moment we left the trail and the hum of civilization behind, something shifted. The air grew heavier, the trees taller, and shadows darker, as if the forest itself were watching. At first, it was subtle, a movement out of the corner of my eye, a black shape slipping between the trees. I shook my head. Probably just a deer, I whispered, trying to convince myself, but the feeling of being followed wouldn't fade. Every crack of a branch underfoot, every rustle in the underbrush made my pulse spike. By nightfall, the whispers started, not voices, exactly, but faint, almost deliberate sounds that didn't belong to any animal I knew. One of my friends, Mark, swore he saw a figure crouched at the edge of our campsite. "Did you see that?" he asked, eyes wide, voice trembling. We laughed it off, though none of us really felt like laughing. I stayed awake, flashlight cutting through the darkness, catching only glimpses of a tall, featureless shadow that seemed to vanish whenever I tried to focus on it. The woods around us were silent, yet alive, as if every tree held a secret it refused to share. And I realized then, the woods have secrets no one dares to speak aloud. When we finally packed up to leave, I felt it trailing us to the edge of the trees, a presence lingering just beyond the firelight, and even now, months later, I can't shake the memory of those eyes, or the feeling that whatever followed us didn't want us gone. This wasn't the end, not by a long shot. Whatever lurks in the shadows, it's only growing bolder. Story number 3. The Night Visitor. I woke to a soft tapping at my window. Tap, tap, tap. At first I assumed it was a branch or a raccoon. Yeah, sure. A raccoon with impeccable timing, I muttered to myself. Pulling the blanket closer like that would help. The tapping didn't stop. It grew deliberate, measured, as if someone or something was testing the glass. Heart pounding, I tiptoed to the window, peering through the blinds. At first, I saw nothing. Then, out of the corner of my eye, a pale face merged, pressed against the glass. Eyes wide and unblinking, I stumbled back, bumping into the dresser. Okay, definitely not a raccoon, I whispered. Every logical thought was screaming at me to grab my phone, call someone, anything. But the part of my brain still clinging to normalcy argued, maybe it's just a prank. Maybe I'm losing it. The figure tilted its head unnaturally, studying me like a cat sizing up a trapped mouse. My pulse thundered in my ears. I wanted to laugh to mask the fear. Because what else do you do when confronted by something clearly insane? But even the laugh caught in my throat, and then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it vanished. No knock, no sound, no trace, except the lingering feeling that it hadn't just been curious, it had been hunting, calculating. Not all ghostly encounters are accidents. Some of them are invitations. And I had just learned in the quietest, darkest hour of the night that some visitors don't knock politely. They wait until you're defenseless, and they decide when the game begins. Story number 4. The Vanishing Hitchhiker. It was late, the kind of night where the world feels suspended between reality and something else. I was driving down an empty highway when I saw her, standing by the side of the road, thumb out, drenched in the soft glow of my headlights. She looked young, maybe late teens, with a pale blue hoodie clinging to her frame. For a moment, I hesitated. Part of me screamed, "Don't stop, don't." But curiosity, or maybe guilt, when I pulled over. "Need a ride?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She nodded silently and climbed in, shivering. "Where to?" I offered. She pointed down the road, barely whispering the name of a street I didn't recognize. We drove in silence for a few miles. The air between us was thick, almost tangible. I glanced over. Her eyes reflected the streetlights unnaturally, like she wasn't entirely there. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice betraying my unease. She nodded. a small haunting smile curling her lips. When we reached the address, the house looked abandoned, boarded up, windows dark. "This is me," she said softly. I turned to speak, but the seat was empty. Just like that. My hands gripped the wheel. Heart hammering, I stumbled out, expecting a trick, a prank, anything, nothing. Just the cold wind and the faint echo of footsteps fading into the night. Somehow, I knew she wasn't alone. Stories like hers, whispers of travelers disappearing at the edge of the road, are part of something bigger. An invisible network of hauntings that no one talks about. And it became clear to me, supernatural forces aren't random. They choose, they wait, and they follow patterns we aren't meant to understand. And that pattern was far from finished. Story number 5. The mirror that sees you. I started seeing things I never remembered learning. And sometimes they looked back at me. It began innocuously. Slight delays in my reflection. A twitch of my eye that I didn't feel. A smile that wasn't mine. My bedroom mirror had always been ordinary. Plain glass in a wooden frame. But suddenly, it seemed aware. At first I blamed fatigue, long days, too much screen time, maybe stress. But the reflections kept changing, subtle at first. A book on my desk that appeared to move in the glass before it did in real life. Shadows that didn't match the room. Whispers I could only hear when staring at my own face. One night, I leaned closer, squinting, trying to focus. My reflection blinked. Once, twice, and then paused words I couldn't hear. "Do you see me?" My chest tightened. I stepped back, telling myself it was impossible, that mirrors don't talk. Yet I couldn't ignore the feeling of being watched, of some consciousness observing me, learning me, waiting. I began noticing more. Tiny, impossible details, scratches on the frame that weren't there yesterday, faint silhouettes moving behind me in the reflection when the room was empty. The mirror knew things I didn't, secrets I hadn't spoken aloud, and somehow it delighted in showing me glimpses of them. What started as a curiosity became dread. I couldn't look away, and I couldn't escape. The ordinary walls of my room felt smaller, suffocating, as if the supernatural was creeping in, eroding the boundary between my world and whatever was on the other side. And I knew, with an instinct that chilled me to the bone, that this was only the beginning. Story number 6. The Forgotten Room. It wasn't supposed to exist. The floor plan of the house showed only a simple hallway and bedrooms. But a draft, cold, unnatural, kept wafting from behind one wall. Curiosity, of course, got the better of me. I pressed against the paneling, and to my shock, it gave way, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling downward into darkness. I hesitated, flashlight trembling in my hand. Every instinct screamed to leave, but the pull was irresistible. The steps were dusty, unused for decades. At the bottom, I found a door, heavy and warped, with scratches, as if something had clawed at it from the other side. I pushed it open. The room was empty. Almost old furniture, overturned and rotting, filled the corners. But the walls were covered in strange marks. Words, symbols, names etched deep, like someone had been desperate to leave a record. A chill ran down my spine. Some of the marks looked familiar. Names I had heard in stories, tales of hauntings, of vanishings. It was as if all the horrors I'd been hearing about were catalogued here, preserved in silence. And then I understood. The room wasn't just forgotten. It was waiting, holding on to the echoes of everything that had come before. Shadows seemed to linger just past the edges of the flashlight beam, as if aware of my intrusion. Whatever haunted that room, it wasn't isolated. It was part of a pattern, a chain of terrors connecting one story to the next. And as I climbed back up into the light, I realized the next chapter would show me just how far these connections reach and how impossible it was to escape them. Story number 7. The phone call. It started with a single call. The screen lit up with an unknown number, and a chill ran down my spine. I answered cautiously, expecting silence or a wrong number. Instead, there was breathing. Slow, deliberate, almost deliberate enough to be aware I was listening. "Hello?" I whispered, trying to mask the tremor in my voice. Nothing. Just that heavy, wet inhale on the other end. I hung up, telling myself it was a prank, a glitch. But then the calls kept coming. Same number, same silence. I checked the number online. Nothing came up. No owner, no record, nothing. But maybe some things aren't meant to be found. That thought made the hair on my arm stand on end. I began noticing patterns. The calls always came at 3:03 a.m., sometimes multiple times in a row. And with each ring, I could swear I heard whispers. Faint, almost intelligible, echoing something I didn't yet understand. One night, I picked up on a whim, bracing for nothing, and then a voice spoke. Soft, low, impossible to ignore. "I see you," it said. My blood ran cold. The air in the room felt heavier, the shadows longer, and for the first time, I realized this wasn't random. There was a design to it, a sequence I hadn't pieced together yet. Every call, every shadow, every whisper, it was building towards something, and the realization hit me with a sickening certainty. These ghostly events weren't isolated. They were connected, part of a pattern I might not survive discovering. Story number 8. The Attic Watcher. The attic had always been dusty, silent, full of forgotten boxes and spider webs. But then I started hearing it. Soft footsteps overhead, whispers that seemed to seep through the floorboards. At first, I chalked it up to rats or the house settling. That's what a rational person would do, right? But the sound grew deliberate, pacing back and forth, like someone or something was tracing the perimeter, studying the space. I crept up the ladder one night, flashlight in hand, and the air hit me first. Heavy, stale, almost aware. I swung the beam across old trunks and furniture, finding nothing at first, and yet I could feel it. Eyes, just beyond the shadows. Then I caught movement, a pale face peeking from behind an old wardrobe. It vanished before I could react, leaving only the feeling of being observed. The attic seemed alive, remembering every sound, every secret, every trespass. It had seen everything, remembers everything, and it wasn't pleased with my curiosity. I fled down the ladder, heart racing, convinced I'd imagined it. But when I reached the floor, I realized the whispers had followed me, echoing through the house in impossible ways. And in that moment, I understood. The danger wasn't confined to the attic. Wherever the unseen resides, it stretches, it follows, and it waits for you to slip whatever was watching from above. It wasn't the only one, and I was beginning to see just how wide the net had spread. Story number 9. The Cursed Object. It was just a small trinket, a carved wooden owl I found at a flea market. Nothing flashy, nothing expensive. I thought it would be a cute addition to my shelf. But from the moment I brought it home, things started off. At first, it was little things. My coffee mug would fall off the counter for no reason. A drawer left open that I was certain I had closed. I laughed nervously, chalking it up to clumsiness. But then, the air in the apartment shifted. It felt heavier, colder, like someone had exhaled directly into the room. When I wasn't looking, I noticed the owl's eyes. Or rather, I thought I noticed them, following me across the room. Silly, I told myself, projecting fear onto a piece of wood. But I couldn't shake it. I started having nightmares, brief flashes of shadowy figures, and the whispers returned, soft and mocking, always around the owl. One evening, I tried to move it to the attic, hoping the problem would vanish. The moment I set it down, the shadows seemed to recoil, almost as if the object carried its own gravity of malice. That's when I realized the object wasn't just cursed. It was a conduit, a small node in a network of something far larger, linking rooms, houses, and stories I didn't yet understand. Every glance at it was a reminder. Some things are small in size, but enormous in consequence. And as the shadow stretched and crept along the walls, I knew the curse wasn't confined to my apartment. It had a way of reaching, of connecting, of finding you. Wherever you hide, the owl stared, unblinking, and I realized I was far from safe. Story number 10. The shadow in the photograph. I was sorting through old photos when I found it. A picture I didn't remember taking. A snapshot of my living room. Perfectly ordinary. Except for one detail. A dark figure standing just behind the couch. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. A shadow caught at the wrong angle. But the more I stared, the more impossible it seemed. The figure wasn't like any shadow I'd ever seen. It had shape, presence, awareness. My hand shook as I lifted the photo closer. The eyes, or the sense of them, seemed to stare right through me. I laughed nervously, trying to convince myself I was imagining it. Of course, it's just a reflection or a smudge. But my apartment was empty, the sun streaming through the windows, and still, that figure remained. I couldn't stop checking corners, mirrors, my reflection. Every small noise felt amplified, every shadow potentially alive. And then I realized, some things are already watching you. You just don't know it until you catch a glimpse, a photograph, a reflection, or a sound that shouldn't exist. The photo burned in my mind, not just for what it showed, but for what it implied. Whoever or whatever was captured there wasn't confined to film. It was patient. It lingered. It waited, and I had a sinking certainty that my next encounter wasn't going to be caught in a photo. It was coming for me. Story number 11. The doll that moves. It was supposed to be harmless. A vintage porcelain doll I found at a yard sale. Cute, in a creepy way. Perfect for my quirky collection. I placed it on the shelf and went about my day, chuckling to myself. Yeah, sure. Dolls move on their own. What am I, 5? That night, I woke to a faint thump. I froze, convinced I'd imagined it. Then I saw her. The doll wasn't on the shelf anymore. She was sitting on the edge of my bed, facing me, head tilted like she was studying me. I blinked. Okay, very funny, universe. I get it, I muttered, voice shaking. No one else was home. Over the next few nights, the movements grew bolder. Sometimes she'd be standing by the door when I woke, sometimes turned toward the window, her glassy eyes following my every move. I started talking to her, nervously joking. Really? Again? You're exhausting. No response, of course, except for the occasional unsettling tilt of the head. And then she smiled. Not a normal tall smile. Something sharper, knowing, deliberate. My blood ran cold. I realized this wasn't just a quirky artifact. It was aware, and worse, connected. Everything I had been experiencing, the shadows, the whispers, the cursed objects, they weren't isolated incidents. It all wove together into a single terrifying pattern. And that pattern? It was just beginning to tighten its grip. I had no idea how far it would reach, but I knew one thing for certain: nothing in my apartment, or maybe in my life, would ever be the same. Story number 12. The Whispering Walls. The house was old, charming in daylight, but at night, it became something else entirely. That's when I first heard it. Soft murmurs, barely audible, curling along the walls like smoke. At first, I thought it was the wind or my imagination, but the whispers persisted, growing clearer with each passing night. They spoke in fragmented sentences, names, places, and warnings that seemed uncannily familiar. You lied, one would hiss. Don't look behind you. Another breathed. My heart raced. The walls knew things they shouldn't. My secrets, the little fears I'd buried deep, they were all out there, etched into the very structure of the house. I tried to talk back, muttering, "This is ridiculous. It's just creaking boards." But the voices ignored me, continuing their deliberate, mocking cadence. I could feel them pressing in, leaning closer, as if the house itself were alive, aware, and judging. And as I listened, I realized something far more unsettling. By hearing them, I had become part of it too. The walls weren't just observing. They were feeding, remembering, recording. Every haunted space I'd encountered, the attic, the cursed object, the mirror, they were threads in the same tapestry, stitched together by the same malevolent hand. The house had stories, yes, but it also had plans. And now I could see how every corner of this world was connected, how nothing truly escaped the reach of what lingered, whispered, and waited. Story number 13. The Forgotten Grave. I stumbled across it by accident, half buried under years of overgrowth. A small, weathered headstone, tilted and cracked, with strange markings etched deep into the stone. Symbols I couldn't decipher, letters that seemed to shift when I looked away. My curiosity overpowered my fear, and I crouched closer, brushing away dirt and leaves. As soon as I touched it, the air thickened, heavy and cold, like the grave was exhaling. A whisper slid through the trees, soft, urgent, almost pleading. I froze. "Who's there?" I called, voice trembling. Only the wind answered, though it carried a strange cadence, as if trying to mimic speech. The shadows around me shifted unnaturally, twisting into forms that seemed almost human. I felt eyes on my back, and I swore I heard footsteps crunching the leaves behind me. Though when I turned, there was nothing. My pulse thudded in my ears, drowning out reason. I left quickly, but the feeling followed me, a persistent weight in the air, as if the grave had claimed my attention, my fear, and I knew instinctively that it wasn't alone. Something ancient lingered here, tethered to the world by secrets long forgotten. The forgotten grave wasn't just a relic. It was almost a warning, a quiet herald of something far larger, far more relentless. Whatever haunted it was preparing, and I had only glimpsed the beginning of a force that would touch everything I thought was safe. Story number 14. The Phantom Footsteps. It started subtly, soft thuds behind me in the hallway, echoing in perfect rhythm with my own steps. I convinced myself it was the old house settling, floorboards contracting, nothing more. But then I began noticing patterns. The footsteps didn't stop when I paused. Sometimes I would stand completely still, heart hammering, and hear them continue, circling, lingering, waiting. I tried to speak to them. "Who's there?" My voice cracked. Silence answered, except for the measured, deliberate echo of steps that weren't mine. It didn't matter where I went, the sound followed. Sometimes I could feel them in the room, even when my eyes told me I was alone. It was a presence, patient and unyielding, brushing at the edge of perception. One night, I froze in the living room, breath shallow, flashlight trembling in my hand. The footsteps stopped. My chest unclenched, briefly, then behind me, just outside the beam of light, a floorboard groaned under weight that wasn't there. I spun. Nothing. But I knew the sensation. Something was waiting, observing, calculating. Sometimes you can feel them even when no one is there. Sometimes that's worse than seeing. The phantom footsteps weren't random. They were deliberate. They were part of a pattern that was closing in. And I had begun to understand the terrifying truth. Whatever was stalking me wasn't alone. And it wasn't done. Not by a long shot. Story number 15. The final encounter. I thought I was done. I'd survived the haunted apartment, the shadow in the woods, the night visitor, the vanishing hitchhiker, the mirror, the forgotten room, the phone calls, the attic, the cursed object, the doll, the whispering walls, the forgotten grave, the phantom footsteps. And yet, here I was, back in my own apartment, the air thick and familiar in a way that made my skin crawl. It remembered me. Every fear, every glance over my shoulder, every whispered warning. The shadows move differently now. Deliberate, almost intelligent. The mirror reflected things that hadn't been there before. The doll standing on the shelf, the owl perched on the counter, even the pale figure from the woods crouched in the corner. The whispers returned, louder this time, threading together fragments from all the previous encounters. Leave. Watch. Follow. My pulse thundered as the faucet began dripping again. The attic door creaked, and the faint sound of footsteps circled the room. Every haunting, every cursed object, every spectral presence, it had converged. I ran through the apartment, heart hammering, adrenaline surging. Shadows lunged at the edges of my vision, and I felt the weight of unseen eyes pressing in from all directions. I barely made it to the front door. Throwing it open to the night air, I thought I was free. But as I looked back, the shadows coalesced into a single shape, familiar and impossibly wrong. It tilted its head, smiled, and vanished, leaving only the sense that it was still there. Still waiting, still remembering. I escaped, yes. But I know this isn't over. Some things never forget. And I can only hope you're not next. Now that you've traveled with me through these shadows, through the whispers, the mirrors, the footsteps, and the forgotten rooms, I hope you feel the same unease I do. Each story, each encounter might have seemed isolated at first. But the truth is, they are threads in a single tangled web. A web that stretches far beyond what we can see, into corners of reality most of us choose to ignore. Remember, some of these stories don't end when the lights go out. That apartment, the woods, the doll, the cursed objects, they linger. They wait, and the simple act of hearing them, of watching them, might just draw them closer. Maybe they're already here, breathing at the edges of your awareness. As you listen, as you read, I want to know, have you ever felt something you couldn't explain? Have you noticed shadows where none should be? Heard whispers in silence or glimpsed figures that vanish when you turn your head. Share your experiences. Comment your theories. Tell me what you've seen or what you fear you might see. Every story, every shared memory keeps this web alive. And in some way, you're now part of it too. Be cautious though. The next creak of a floorboard, the flicker of a light, or the reflection in a mirror might not be as innocent as it seems even now. You may feel eyes where no one should be looking, or hear whispers that were never there before. The stories you've just witnessed are only fragments of a larger, unseen world, and it has a way of reaching those who pay attention. So as you turn off the lights tonight, or glance at the shadows stretching across your room, remember this: the stories don't stop. They evolve, they watch, and they wait. And the next time you hear a tap, a whisper, or a footstep in the dark, maybe it's not your imagination. Maybe it's real. You've seen enough to know you're not truly alone.